Aviation history is full of cases where a plane that initially seemed like an ugly duckling and was absolutely despised by pilots eventually redeemed its reputation and earned a place of honor in the record books. Take the legendary Messerschmitt 109, for example. When Ernst Udet first laid eyes on it, he flatly declared it was no fighter, or the B-26 Marauder, which initially earned the grim nickname Widowmaker, but went on to prove itself as one of the best tactical aircraft of World War II. Yet another aircraft with a rocky journey was the American carrier-based dive bomber built by Curtiss, the SB2C Helldiver. The name Helldiver itself was something of a lucky charm for the Curtiss company. Every carrier-based bomber Curtiss built since the late 20s carried that name. The first of them was the F-8C biplane, which appeared back in 1929. It's widely considered the aircraft that pioneered carrier-based dive bombing, not just in the United States, but around the world. Starting in 1935, its replacement was being developed, the SB2C Scout bomber, which entered service in 1937. It was still a biplane, but it already had an enclosed cockpit and retractable landing gear. In fact, this aircraft turned out to be the last combat biplane the U.S. Navy ever flew. And finally, in 1938, engineers began work on a brand new design, the SB2C monoplane, which is the focus of today's story. Not many people know that Helldiver is actually a nickname for a small diving bird, a grebe, found on the rivers and lakes of the Americas. The bird's official name is the pied-billed grebe. It earned its distinctive nickname because of its remarkable ability to dive much deeper than other waterfowl, stay underwater for a long time, and then suddenly pop up in the most unexpected spot. Americans also call this bird the water witch for exactly the same reason. But let's get back to the planes. By the late 1930s, the Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bomber was being developed for the United States Navy. At the time, it was a very modern aircraft, all metal, low wing, with smooth skin, an enclosed cockpit, and retractable landing gear. But aviation technology was advancing at a breakneck pace, and a major war was looking more and more inevitable. So in August of that same year, the Navy brass drew up requirements for a new, more advanced dive bomber, one that would outperform everything that came before it. The military wanted major improvements in speed, range, and most importantly, bomb load. The Dauntless's standard bomb load on scouting missions was a single 500-pound bomb, though it could carry up to a 1,000-pounder. But by the late 30s, that just wasn't enough to sink large warships with heavy armor and modern defenses. Under the new requirements, the next bomber had to carry twice the ordnance. That meant either one big 1,000-pound bomb or two 500-pounders. On top of that, unlike its predecessors, the new aircraft had to stow all that ordnance inside the fuselage instead of carrying it externally. To give the aircraft enough muscle for the job, the bomber was to be equipped with the brand new 14-cylinder Wright R 2600 Cyclone air-cooled radial engine, cranking out 1,700 horsepower. There was yet another strict requirement that many engineers struggled with. It was about strict limits on the aircraft's size. This came down to the standard aircraft carrier elevator, which measured 40 by 48 feet. The Navy adamantly insisted that two aircraft had to fit on this elevator at the same time. And here was the real kicker. There had to be at least 1 foot of clearance between the outer edges of the planes and the edge of the platform on all sides. Still, these demanding specs didn't scare everyone off. 6 major manufacturers jumped into the competition for this massive military contract. In May 1939, the military reviewed all the submitted designs. The clear winner was Curtiss's design. At the same time, the Navy hedged its bets and also selected an interesting proposal from Brewster as a backup. The U.S. Navy funded prototypes from both companies. By the end of that same year, Curtiss engineers, led by chief designer Raymond Blaylock, kept refining their design. It wasn't until February 1940 that the first serious wind tunnel tests began using a wooden scale model of the new design. And right away, the developers ran into some unpleasant problems. It turned out the plane's stall speed was way too high, a real problem for carrier landings, and it was also dangerously unstable in flight. To fix the first problem, the engineers had to increase the wing area from 386 to 422 square feet. They also added automatic leading-edge slats that deployed and retracted in sync with the landing gear. But the second problem was far trickier to solve. The simplest, most tried and true way to improve stability is to extend the tail section. But that option was completely off the table here because of the strict size limitations the Navy imposed for carrier operations. These tight constraints are exactly what gave the Helldiver its short, chubby look. Think about it. Despite having a takeoff weight twice that of the famous Dauntless, the new plane was only about 4 feet longer. The engineers had just one option left: increase the area of the vertical tail fin. They enlarged the rudder, but in practice it wasn't nearly enough, so they ended up having to do this 2 more times down the road. Despite all these technical headaches, the stellar reputation of Curtiss and the sudden outbreak of war in Europe pushed the Navy to make an unprecedented move. They ordered 370 production Helldivers before the working prototype was even fully built. Since the company's main plant in Buffalo was swamped with orders for P-40 Warhawk fighters, a brand new factory in Columbus was tapped to build the new dive bombers. Finally, on December 13, 1940, the very first prototype officially rolled out of the factory. At its core, it was an all-metal, low-wing aircraft. Its skin was made from a durable alloy coated with pure aluminum to protect against saltwater corrosion. The rudder and ailerons were fabric-covered over a metal frame to save weight. The fuselage itself had a smooth, oval cross-section, and the wings were tapered with rounded tips. Along the entire trailing edge of the wings, engineers installed hydraulically operated flaps that served a critically important function as dive brakes. During takeoff and landing, they simply lowered downward, but when the plane went into a steep dive, these flaps split wide open, instantly and dramatically slowing the aircraft. As one test pilot jokingly put it, the effect of these air brakes was so powerful, it felt like hitting a brick wall. Since the aircraft was designed for carrier operations, where every square foot of deck space counted, the wings were made to fold. To reduce the plane's footprint while parked on deck, the wingtips simply folded upward and were secured to the fuselage with metal braces. Inside the massive fuselage sat a spacious bomb bay. Under the original specs, it had to comfortably hold 2 500-pound bombs or one massive 1,000-pounder. Since a bomb released during a steep dive could accidentally strike the propeller, the engineers came up with a clever mechanism. The ordnance was suspended on swinging trapeze mounts that swung the bombs clear of the propeller arc at the moment of release. If a mission called for maximum punch, the plane could give up some fuel and carry a monster 1,600-pound bomb, or even a full-size aerial torpedo, the Mark 13. Of course, in this overloaded configuration, the bomb bay doors simply couldn't close all the way. They remained partially open throughout the entire flight, creating extra drag and really hurting the plane's performance. The offensive armament was impressive for its time, making the Helldiver effective even in a ground attack role. 2 50 cal Brownings sat right above the engine, with 2 more in the center wing section, well clear of the propeller arc. To defend the aircraft from behind, the rear gunner was equipped with twin 30 cal Brownings on a ring mount. To give the gunner a better view and a much wider field of fire, the designers came up with a really clever feature for the time: a folding section of the fuselage behind the cockpit that smoothly lowered downward. Pilots quickly nicknamed this contraption the Turtle because of how it looked. Originally, Curtiss wanted to install a full-powered hydraulic gun turret, similar to the one that would later appear on the Avenger torpedo bombers. But they had to scrap the idea. It made the plane too heavy. The first prototype, the SB2C was fitted with a brand new but still very much unfinished Cyclone R 2600-8 engine. It produced 1,700 horsepower, a remarkable figure for the time, and drove a large 3-bladed automatic propeller made by Curtiss Electric. Since both the engine and the propeller hadn't been properly fine-tuned yet, they kept running into one technical issue after another. This didn't just slow down the entire test program, it also put test pilots in serious danger more than once. Flight testing of this troubled prototype began on December 18, 1940. At that point, the aircraft had no combat weapons installed. All the gun ports were simply covered with blanking plates. After several taxi runs along the runway, Curtiss's chief test pilot, Lloyd Child, lifted the aircraft into the sky for the very first time. The pilot's reports from this and all subsequent flights were mixed. On one hand, the new aircraft showed solid handling. Its top speed reached about 320 miles per hour, which was exceptionally fast for a bomber of that era. On the other hand, the aircraft proved wildly unstable on all three axes. It responded very poorly to control inputs at low speeds, and that was critically dangerous during carrier landings, where precision is critical. Another major headache was that the powerful engine kept overheating badly. On February 8th, during a routine test flight, the engine suddenly failed. The pilot tried to glide back to the runway but simply didn't have enough altitude, and the aircraft was destroyed in a crash landing. Fortunately, the pilot walked away with barely a scratch, but the aircraft itself now needed a serious overhaul. Testing didn't resume until May 6th, but the relief was short-lived. Barely a week later, there was another accident. This time, a landing gear strut collapsed during a ground taxi run. Although mechanics repaired the damage quickly, it was painfully obvious that the aircraft's design needed serious reworking. Despite all these setbacks, test flights continued through August, after which the SB2C prototype was finally sent back to the factory floor for modifications. The engineers' top priority was solving the chronic engine overheating problem. They significantly enlarged the oil cooler air intake and widened the cooling gills at the back of the engine cowling. In September, the team conducted several more flights to check how the modified engine was performing. Then in October, another round of upgrades began. The engineers once again increased the tail fin area and also extended the engine mount by exactly 1 foot. This was done to shift the center of gravity forward and improve stability. It was at this stage that the bomber finally received its full combat armament. By November, the most demanding tests began, checking behavior in spins and steep dives. Unfortunately, the prototype couldn't handle these extreme stresses. On December 21st, pilot Baron Hulse put the bomber into a steep vertical dive from nearly 22,000 feet. As the pilot began pulling out of the dive, the enormous G-forces tore the tail fin clean off, and the right wing just disintegrated in midair. By sheer miracle, Baron Hulse managed to bail out with his parachute in time and save his life. But the only flying Helldiver in existence plummeted to the ground and was reduced to a heap of twisted metal. This horrific crash brought the entire test program to a complete halt for 5 long months. Meanwhile, as bombs rained down on Pearl Harbor and sailors fought for their lives in the water, the United States officially entered World War II. The fleet desperately needed new carrier-based bombers. They were vital to winning the war. But the worst part was that the military had virtually no alternatives. The backup aircraft from Brewster, called the Buccaneer, turned out to be even worse than its unfinished competitor. And although this machine did go into serial production, the Navy never dared send a single one of the roughly 770 built into combat. They were kept far from the front lines, used exclusively as training aircraft for young cadets and as tow planes for aerial targets. That left only one option: whip the Curtiss dive bomber into shape. And here, the Americans rolled the dice. Even though the first Helldiver prototype's testing had ended in disaster, they decided not to waste precious time building and carefully fine-tuning a second prototype. Instead, the aircraft was immediately rushed into mass production. Just imagine how risky that was. Further testing and critical design changes would have to happen simultaneously with the production of serial aircraft. According to pre-war plans, the first production Helldiver was supposed to roll off the assembly line at the Columbus factory back in December 1941. And by April of the following year, the plant was expected to churn out at least 85 of these aircraft per month. But the constant delays in prototype testing, the never-ending design revisions, and various organizational problems all took their toll. As a result, the second experimental aircraft, which also happened to be the first production SB2C, didn't roll off the line until June 1942, massively behind schedule. The new SB2C version differed significantly from its predecessor, and not all of these changes were for the better. The tail fin had to be enlarged for the 3rd time before it finally reached its final size and shape. The engineers also strengthened the wing and tail structure while removing the tail wheel well doors. Under the wings, they added hardpoints that could carry 2 100-pound bombs, additional 58-gallon fuel tanks, or gun pods. They also reconfigured the armament. The machine guns previously mounted above the engine were moved to the center wing section, and instead of the twin turret-mounted guns, there was now just a single 50-cal Browning in the rear. In the pilot's cockpit, engineers swapped the old telescopic sight for a modern reflector sight, while the gunner radioman station got a radio compass and a new anti-shipping radar. After what they saw over Europe and in the brutal early fighting across the Pacific, one thing was clear. The aircraft desperately needed reliable passive protection. With that in mind, the Helldiver received thick, armored glass in the cockpit windshield and an armored seat back to protect the pilot. The gunner radioman's station was also lined with armor plating, and the fuel tanks were made self-sealing so a single bullet wouldn't set them ablaze. But all that protection came at a steep price. Thanks to all these modifications and heavy armor, the aircraft packed on a whopping 3,000 extra pounds. Naturally, all that extra weight killed its performance. To put the problem in perspective, the plane's top speed dropped from 320 down to 280 miles per hour. And the landing speed climbed dangerously from 69 to 79 miles per hour, making landings a lot trickier. But despite all of this, the admirals had to work with what they had, and nobody was about to give up on this admittedly problematic aircraft. In fact, back in July, when testing of the second prototype had only just begun, the military ordered a staggering 4,000 Helldivers. Now that's betting big. The plan called for 3,000 brand new dive bombers from the Columbus plant, while another 1,000 were assigned to the Canadian Car and Foundry Company. Meanwhile, far across the vast Pacific, the aging Dauntless dive bombers kept carrying the load on the front lines. These reliable workhorses delivered the stunning American victory at the Battle of Midway, a true strategic turning point in the entire war. As for the new Helldivers, they didn't start reaching combat units until late 1942. In December, the first batches of aircraft were delivered to carrier squadrons from the legendary USS Essex, which were later transferred to the brand new USS Bunker Hill. Shortly after, pilots from the USS Yorktown squadrons also switched over to the new aircraft. Pilots who had grown accustomed to the incredibly responsive and easy-to-fly Dauntless greeted the new aircraft with outright hostility. And they had good reasons. The Helldiver really was far more demanding to fly. Noticeably heavier, sluggish, and significantly less maneuverable. Landing accidents on the pitching flight deck of a carrier quickly became an everyday occurrence. Fleetwags immediately came up with their own sarcastic reading of the official SB2C designation, son of a bitch second class. But over time, another even catchier nickname took hold among pilots: Beast. Throughout the winter of 1942 and 43, the flight decks of the Yorktown and Bunker Hill became the scene of what could only be described as a rodeo. Pilots were flipping over on the flight deck, snapping arresting cables, slamming into the ship's superstructure at speed, and even going overboard. All of this happened during desperate attempts to tame this wild aircraft that had already earned the name Beast. Some officers were openly saying that the Helldiver bombers needed to be scrapped and replaced with the tried-and-true old Dauntless. But gradually, things started to improve. American pilots were getting used to the Helldiver's high landing speed. They finally learned how to safely approach the deck, knowing that this heavy aircraft wasn't exactly nimble. By May of 43, several squadrons from the Yorktown became the first to complete the demanding retraining cycle and were cleared for combat duty. That same year, fighting across the Pacific eased up somewhat. This worked in the Americans' favor, as it gave them the extra time they badly needed to build up their forces and better train their personnel. By spring, factories had already rolled out 600 brand new Helldivers across the first two variants. The two versions weren't drastically different from each other, since engineers were constantly making dozens of small improvements to the design right on the production line. By mid-year, a third, significantly updated version appeared, designated the SB2C-1C. Its differences from the earlier models were much more noticeable. For instance, instead of the single movable 50 cal gun for the rear gunner, the designers installed twin 30 cal machine guns, just like the original prototype. Additionally, the tailwheel was made fixed, meaning it no longer retracted into the fuselage during flight. The true baptism of fire for this beast came on November 11, 1943. A squadron from the USS Bunker Hill, commanded by Lieutenant Commander James Vose, took part in a major strike on Rabaul. At the time, it was the largest Japanese naval and air base in the South Pacific. The attack went remarkably well. American air crews sent the destroyer Suzunami to the bottom, damaged the cruisers Agano and Yubari, and hit several more enemy ships, all at the cost of several aircraft lost. The next major mission for the Helldivers was providing air support for the amphibious assault on Tarawa Atoll. In this operation, the dive bombers pushed to their absolute limits, relentlessly pounding fortified Japanese positions with bombs and heavy machine gun fire. Since enemy anti-aircraft fire was light, American crews practically hovered over the enemy all day long. They'd only head back to the carrier now and then to top off fuel and reload ammunition. All that long, grueling training had finally paid off, and the infantry genuinely thanked the air crews for their pinpoint accuracy and devastating firepower. These successes over Rabaul and Tarawa became a turning point for an aircraft whose reputation seemed beyond saving. These victories finally convinced the Navy to go all in on the Helldiver, officially retiring the old Dauntless for good. By January of '44, the fleet was rapidly swapping out the old dive bombers for the new aircraft. Over the next 6 months, these aircraft fully equipped the air groups on several key carriers, including the famous Yorktown, Hornet, Bunker Hill, Wasp, and Essex. Meanwhile, Curtiss wasn't sitting idle and kept refining the design. In the spring of '44, an entirely new variant of the bomber began reaching the fleet under the designation SB2C-1C. In the center wing section of this model, instead of the 4 standard 50 cal machine guns, there were now 2 powerful 20mm Hispano cannons. They came with a generous ammo supply, 200 rounds per gun. In total, 778 of these SB2C-1C models rolled off the production line. If we rewind a bit, there's an interesting footnote. Back in early '43, a unique experimental Helldiver fitted with float landing gear for water takeoffs was undergoing testing. This variant received the designation XSB2C2. Initially, the Navy was very interested and even placed an order for nearly 300 production units. But the admirals eventually changed their minds. They decided they didn't really need a float plane like this and canceled the order entirely. As for the aircraft's overall design, the Curtiss SB2C Helldiver was an all-metal, single-engine, 2-seat scout bomber built in a classic monoplane configuration. This aircraft was designed from the ground up for carrier operations. The primary requirement was that the aircraft could operate and carry out combat missions from the decks of every aircraft carrier in the United States Navy fleet at the time. The fuselage of this aircraft was entirely metal, and its outer skin was made of sturdy aluminum alloy sheets. In the forward section, the designers installed a robust steel firewall. It protected the crew from fire and also served as the engine mount. Directly behind it sat the pilot's cockpit. It was separated from the rest of the fuselage by a massive armor plate to give the pilot maximum protection in combat. Behind this armor sat the main fuel tank with self-sealing protection. Directly beneath the cockpit was the bomb bay, and a bit further aft past the fuel tank, the radio equipment and survival kit. This kit was essential in case of a water landing or a crash in the middle of nowhere. Further along the fuselage came the gunner radio man's compartment. Twin machine guns were mounted there on a movable turret. To give the gunner a better view and wider firing angles, the section of fuselage directly behind his station was designed to fold down. This let him fend off enemy fighters much more effectively no matter which direction they came from. In the forward section of the bomb bay, the engineers incorporated a clever mechanism, a bomb displacement gear. Its job was to make sure that when a bomb dropped, it swung clear of the propeller. This system was critical during steep dive attacks. A single heavy 1,000-pound bomb was typically mounted on this gear. Depending on the mission, the bay could also hold 2 smaller 500-pound bombs. If you looked inside the pilot's cockpit, right in the center of the instrument panel, you'd find all the navigation instruments the pilot needed. The side panels held the radio controls, bomb arming panel, and throttle. To the pilot's right was the lever for the dive brakes. Pilots used these extensively, not just during takeoff and landing, but also to stabilize the aircraft during high-speed bombing dives. Flying the aircraft was standard for the era, a conventional stick and rudder pedals. Starting with the SB2C-1C variant, the aircraft was equipped with a modern hydraulic system for deploying the dive brakes, which made the pilot's job a lot easier. The cockpit was fully enclosed with a transparent canopy that conveniently slid backward. For added safety, the windshield was armored. As for the gunner radio man, he had quite a few responsibilities. Beyond handling comms and defending the plane's tail, he also operated the onboard radar. In the early stages, this was the ASB system, which was later replaced by the more advanced ANAPS-4 radar. The metal wing was built tough and broke down into 3 main sections, a fixed center section and 2 outer panels that could fold upward. This was extremely practical for saving space on carrier flight decks. The top of the wing was covered with tough aluminum alloy sheeting. It had a slight upward dihedral of 6 degrees and an angle of incidence of 1.5 degrees. On the leading edge, automatic slat panels were installed to improve handling, while the trailing edge featured the powerful dive brakes. Incidentally, on later versions, such as the SB2C, these brakes were made perforated, with holes cut into them, for better aerodynamics. The wingtips had large, movable ailerons. Their framework was metal, but they were covered with durable fabric to keep the weight down. The tail section had a classic layout using a mix of materials. The horizontal stabilizer was perfectly flat and set at an angle of 3 degrees. The vertical stabilizer was intentionally offset 1.5 degrees to the left, a clever way to counteract the propeller's torque, which constantly pulled the aircraft to one side. The main tail structure had metal skin, while the rudder and elevator were fabric covered to save weight. The landing gear was a conventional tail dragger setup, 2 main struts and a small tail wheel. During flight, the front gear neatly retracted into special wells in the wings using powerful hydraulics, while the rear wheel remained exposed, covered by a streamlined fairing to reduce drag. For smooth landings, the struts were fitted with oleo shock absorbers. The large main wheels had pneumatic brakes. For reference, the main wheel tires measured 32 by 8.8 inches, while the smaller tail wheel was 8 by 4.5 inches. Powering this war machine was a massive 14-cylinder air-cooled Wright R2600 Cyclone radial engine. This powerhouse cranked out a staggering 1,900 horsepower. Depending on the production date, the engine was paired with a large 3-bladed propeller on early versions or an even more efficient 4-bladed prop on later models. As for armament, this aircraft was a true flying arsenal. Initially, it carried 5 50 cal machine guns. 4 were built right into the wings, and 1 more defended the rear from the gunner's position. On later production runs, the firepower was significantly boosted. 2 powerful 20mm cannons were mounted in the wings, while the gunner got 2 rapid-fire 30 cal machine guns. In the internal bomb bay, the aircraft could carry 1 devastating 1,000-pound bomb or 2 500-pounders. Additionally, 2 more 500-pound bombs could be hung externally under the wings. The SB2C took things even further. Up to 8 5-inch HVAR rockets could now be mounted under the wings.